This is a key, just an ordinary brass key, nothing special about it. But this key, or rather, the absence of this key, may have sealed the fate of over 1,500 people. Now, you probably think you know the story of the Titanic. Unsinkable ship hits iceberg, tragic sinking. But there's a detail about that night that most people have never heard. A detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it's almost absurd how much it mattered. This is the story of what happened on April 14, 1912. This is David Blair, second officer of the RMS Titanic. Well, he was supposed to be. Blair was an experienced sailor, 37 years old, with years of service with the White Star Line. He knew the ship inside and out. He'd been involved in her final preparations, her sea trials, everything. For weeks, Blair had been preparing for what would be the voyage of his career. The maiden voyage of the largest, most luxurious ship ever built. He had his cabin, his duties, his responsibilities. He was ready. But then, just days before departure, a telegram arrived. Due to a last-minute crew reshuffle, Blair was being replaced by Chief Officer Henry Wilde. Blair was out. Imagine that. You've prepared for months, you know every inch of the ship, and suddenly you're watching your dream voyage sail away without you. April 10th, 1912, Southampton. The Titanic is preparing to depart on her maiden voyage. There's excitement in the air, passengers boarding, crew making final preparations. And there's David Blair, hastily packing his belongings, saying goodbye to his temporary home. When you're suddenly told you have to leave your job and get off a ship, you're probably in a bit of a rush. You grab your personal items, maybe you forget a few things. That's normal, that's human. But Blair took something with him that he shouldn't have. In his pocket, as he walked down that gangplank for the last time, was a small brass key. This key opened the binoculars locker in the crow's nest, the binoculars that the lookouts would need to spot dangers ahead, and Blair forgot to hand it over. With all the confusion of the crew changes, nobody noticed. The new officers were focused on getting acquainted with the ship, learning their new roles. The lookouts weren't thinking about checking their equipment. They trusted that everything would be in place. And so, the Titanic sailed away, carrying 2,224 souls toward their destiny. And locked away in the crow's nest was a pair of binoculars that nobody could access. For 3 days, the voyage went perfectly. The ship was making good time, the weather was clear, passengers were enjoying themselves. The lookouts in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were doing their job scanning the horizon. During the day, visibility was good. They could see for miles. But at night, well, that was different. You have to understand the conditions on the night of April 14th. It was unusually dark, there was no moon, and the sea was unnaturally calm. So calm that there were no waves breaking against any obstacles ahead. No white foam to give away the presence of something dangerous. Normally, when waves hit an iceberg, they create a white foam that's visible even in darkness. But that night, the sea was like glass. Any iceberg would be nearly invisible, just a dark shape against a dark sky. Fleet and Lee knew they were in iceberg territory. They'd been warned. The radio operators had been receiving ice warnings all day. But with their naked eyes, in those conditions, they were essentially blind beyond a few hundred yards. And there, just a few feet away from them, was the equipment that could have helped them see further. The binoculars that could have given them precious extra minutes of warning time. Locked away, useless. How much difference would binoculars have made? Well, let's think about it. Binoculars typically magnify your vision by 6 to 8 times. That doesn't just make things look bigger, it effectively brings distant objects closer. Something that's barely visible to the naked eye becomes clearly defined through binoculars. In perfect conditions, the human eye can see about 3 miles to the horizon at sea level. But binoculars could potentially extend that effective range for spotting objects. More importantly, they could help distinguish between a dark patch of water and a dark mass of ice. 11:35 p.m. Fleet and Lee are in the crow's nest, their shift nearly over. The ship is traveling at about 22 knots. That's roughly 25 miles per hour. Fast for a ship of that size. They're scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of danger. Remember, they know they're in iceberg territory. They're being as vigilant as they can be with the tools they have. And then Fleet sees it. A dark shape ahead, slightly to starboard. At first, it's just a shadow, barely distinguishable from the water around it. He stares harder, trying to make sense of what he's seeing. Is it a ship? A low-lying cloud? And then the horrible realization hits him. It's an iceberg. Massive. Fleet strikes the warning bell 3 times, the signal for object dead ahead, and grabs the telephone to the bridge. "Is someone there?" Fleet shouts into the phone. "Yes, what do you see?" comes the reply from 6th Officer Moody. "Iceberg right ahead." On the bridge, 1st Officer Murdoch immediately orders, "Hard to starboard." He signals the engine room to stop engines in reverse. The ship begins to turn slowly, ponderously. But it's too late. The ship is too big, too fast, too close. The iceberg scrapes along the starboard side, opening up the hull below the waterline. The damage is done. So let's go back to that key. The key that David Blair forgot to hand over when he left the ship. Fleet spotted the iceberg at approximately 500 yards distance. At 22 knots, that gave them about 37 seconds to react. 37 seconds to turn a 46,000-ton ship. But what if they'd had binoculars? What if they'd spotted that iceberg at 1,000 yards instead of 500? That would have given them about 75 seconds, more than double the reaction time. Now, I'm not saying the binoculars would have definitely prevented the collision. The physics of turning a ship that size are unforgiving. But those extra seconds could have made the difference between a glancing blow and a more direct hit. Between flooding 5 compartments and flooding 4. Between sinking and survival. You see, the Titanic was designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments. The iceberg opened up 5. If the impact had been slightly different. Years later, at the British inquiry into the disaster, Frederick Fleet was asked directly about the binoculars. "Could you have seen the iceberg sooner if you had binoculars?" "We could have seen it a bit sooner," Fleet replied. "How much sooner?" "Well, enough to get out of the way." Meanwhile, David Blair was safe on shore when news of the disaster reached him. Imagine his feelings when he realized what had happened, when he learned that the lookouts had no binoculars, when he felt for that key in his pocket. Blair carried that guilt for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about the key, but those who knew him said he was haunted by it. The idea that his simple oversight, forgetting to hand over a key, might have contributed to the loss of over 1,500 lives. After the disaster, this key was found among Blair's belongings. It's now displayed in a maritime museum, a small object that represents one of history's most tragic what-ifs. Frederick Fleet survived the sinking. He lived until 1965, working various jobs, but he never forgot that night. In his later years, he would often say that if they'd had binoculars, things might have been different. Reginald Lee, his fellow lookout, also survived but died just a few years later in 1913. The trauma of that night, and perhaps the guilt of not seeing the iceberg sooner, weighed heavily on him. The Titanic lies on the ocean floor now, 12,500 feet below the surface. For over a century, we've studied every aspect of the disaster, looking for answers, looking for someone to blame. Was it the steel, the rivets, the design, the speed, the lack of lifeboats, the radio operator who went to sleep? All of these factors played a role. But there's something profound about the idea that a forgotten key might have been just as important as any of them. It makes you think about how history turns on the smallest details, how a moment of forgetfulness, a simple human error, can ripple through time and change everything. David Blair made a mistake. He forgot to hand over a key. It's the kind of mistake any of us might make when we're rushed, when we're disappointed, when our plans suddenly change. But that mistake left 2 men in a crow's nest, staring into the darkness, trying to protect 2,224 souls with nothing but their naked eyes. Today's ships have radar, sonar, GPS, and sophisticated detection systems. The technology has changed dramatically, but the human element, the possibility of error, of oversight, of simply forgetting something important, That remains constant. So the next time you see this key, remember, it's not just a piece of metal. It's a reminder that in our complex world, sometimes the smallest details matter most. And sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph comes down to something as simple as remembering to hand over a key.